Thank you, and I'll start off by thanking Ian for joining NATA here today. I should highlight at the outset of this, I'm not an AI expert, but like most of the people in this room, I'm kind of having it thrust upon me, both in my daily life and my work life, and have as many questions as everyone else. So hopefully I'll be asking questions today, not from the perspective of an expert, but from the perspective of our audience and from the perspective of people who are experiencing this for the first time. So I'd like to start off because Ian has previously said that advances in the capability of large language models and generative AI have taken the world by surprise. And I'd like to start the chat today by really asking about the why of AI. Why have we been so quick to adopt the technology in the last few years?
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and acknowledging also we're on the lands of the Gadigal people today. AI has been around for a very long time, around for about 70 years, but it wasn't very good apart from really narrow applications, and AI has been increasingly getting better and better at smaller and smaller things over time. What changed, of course, was in November 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT, and it's suddenly as if AI fell from heaven. Suddenly everybody was talking about it. And they were talking about it because it could do a wide range of things reasonably well. And of course, we've all heard about hallucinations, we've all heard about some of the funny things that happened in the earliest days, but it could suddenly do a whole lot of stuff. It's not like asking Siri or asking Alexa, hey Alexa, tell me about this, and it comes back with, I don't know, but I found these things on the website. All of a sudden was, write me a song in the style of my favourite jazz artist, and it could do it. So it suddenly took everyone by surprise because it suddenly got reasonably good at a whole range of things.
Okay. And definitely crept up on us.
Indeed, absolutely.
In the abstract for the session, which I'm sure everyone's read on the app, you mentioned that AI is an accelerant and an amplifier, presenting unique challenges for regulating its use. Could you expand on these challenges?
Indeed it is. So all digital tools arguably act as an accelerant. They allow us to do processes and things in a faster way than we've done before, and process automation is a great example of that, and most people will have experienced some sort of process automation. That accelerant also amplifies, and it amplifies because it can take wrinkles in an existing system and really scale them up. So rather than impacting one person per week, it's now hundreds of people per day who potentially can be impacted. But the really, really tricky part about AI, which is different to any other digital tool, is that it also can adapt, which means the way we plan it, the way we deploy it, is not necessarily the same way it's operating within 6 months. It may not still be colouring in within the lines 6 months from now, and especially if you're thinking about an autonomous vehicle, you really do want it to be colouring in within the lines. And all of that was what AI could potentially do prior to the release of the large language models and the generative AI. But as I mentioned, all of a sudden, it wasn't just your algorithm drifting slightly over time or your classifier drifting over time. All of a sudden now it was do something I've never expected before. So write me a song or develop me a presentation or create an image. So apart from previously amplifying, accelerating and adapting and thinking about how you'd manage that, now future AI or current versions of AI can interpolate, can translate, can generate. And that creates a whole new world of challenges beyond just that simple drifting over time from as you established it, as you designed it, versus as you deployed it, or as it operates over time, to now being able to do very different sorts of things in very different sorts of domains, which we really didn't expect. And in fact, we probably held as things that only human beings could do.
Okay, and that was discussed at this morning's session, which again, I'm quite happy to be surprised by this. Took me by surprise where the simple concept of AI picking the next word in a sentence suddenly extends to become writing a poem. And no one thought that that was what they were trying to achieve. I guess there's been many scientific inventions that have had unexpected or unintended outcomes, but they have at least been sort of quantum in their nature, as in one unexpected outcome, not a journey and an adaptation journey.
And I think that does speak to this amplification. The fact that you can get better in multiple different ways at the same time means that it's not just an additive improvement, but it's a multiplicative improvement. And in fact, all of these multiplicative improvements working together gives you an exponential improvement. And in fact, as we've seen, as more and more of these large language models and generative AI variants have come out, not only have they been able to control some of the silly stuff, the hallucinations, but what they can do gets amazingly better very, very quickly. So every couple of months we see these new generations of tools come out which can animate a still image to make it look like it's a short clip of video, to the point where you can just speak words or type words and say, produce a movie for me that looks like someone walking down the street having this adventure in this environment. And that's totally unexpected compared to if we wound the clock back just 2 years. We would really not expect to be able to do that. So that point of unexpected consequences and thinking ahead about both the benefits you can derive from it and also the ways to think about protecting from harms or mitigating harms really is galloping away from us, which requires us to go back to think about some of the principles about what AI can do now versus what it could do previously, and how we think about the unique capabilities and how those unique capabilities might start to challenge, again, domains that we genuinely thought that only people could do.
I mean, picking up on that concept of mitigating from harm, I mean, there's a clear role for standardisation to be applied in the sector, and I understand much progress has been made. But I also understand that in some sectors, and I think education was cited, there are instances where blanket bans are already being applied. Do you feel that our lawmakers and our legislators will wait for the standardisation environment to mature and adopt, or are they likely to jump in with protections in the form of black letter law?
This is a really, really important question. So Europe moved very quickly to put in place legislation, so black letter law, and interestingly referring to standards and referring to anticipated standards. Australia's been much, much more cautious about it, but there's a really active conversation right now about whether or not to regulate and how to regulate. My own personal perspective is that there are a whole lot of elements of AI which are different to other technologies, but there are a whole lot which are also very similar to other technologies. So that amplify, accelerate, that element is true for all digital tools. And so if you're building legislation to protect against potential harms from a process automation, then the elements of that would be directly applicable to AI. But that adaptation, that bit which is different, makes the framework a little harder to think about how you would put in place appropriate protections. How would you protect against something which is adapting? You might require constant calibration. You might require to check whether or not it's still colouring in within the lines. And you might require an explicit point of observation or an explicit point of decision making. In New South Wales, we had a challenge with process automation associated with automatic garnishing of bank accounts within New South Wales government. And the New South Wales Ombudsman said, even though you've automated a process that would always deliver the same result, if A and B then C, a human being still has to make that decision, then C. And so we were getting our heads around that, again, when generative AI and large language models came out. And that not just amplify, adapt, and accelerate component, but now generate, translate, interpolate, gives some extra challenges to think about what would you do to protect people against those capabilities. Now, we have legislation around discrimination, we have legislation around protection of individuals. All of those legislative frameworks still make sense. The question is, can AI suddenly do something different that was not anticipated when writing law, thinking about the capability of human beings? And I've said a couple of times, AI is starting to venture into the space that we thought was uniquely reserved for human beings. And increasingly, we're seeing some of those areas really challenged. We as human beings believe that judgment, creativity, and empathy belong to us, that things that only human beings can do. AI is giving us a run for our money on empathy, or at least simulated empathy, or mimicked empathy. It's giving us a run for our money around creativity, or again, mimicked or synthetic creativity. And some of the challenges we're starting to see is just we didn't envisage that the technology could do those things, and the way that human beings fail or the way that human beings transgress are different to the ways that algorithms fail or the way that algorithms transgress. So I think it's re-emerged as a really important discussion right at the moment to think about how would you create legislation that speaks to the unique capabilities of new AI and would even foresee the capabilities of the next or the next generation of AI. And that's a tough one. That's really a tough one. But boiling it down to what can AI do that's different to any digital tool, or in fact any tool whatsoever, ultimately becomes that really important test.
Okay. My mind turned to the old sort of legal principle of the reasonable man test, and I wonder whether we're going to need to develop the reasonable AI test. I'm not sure how that would work. One of the questions I had here, and I think I'll flip it around a little bit, because I was going to ask the question, which international jurisdictions are the most advanced in regulating AI? You mentioned that Europe's gone to a very prescriptive model, but I think I might flip the question around, because perhaps the question shouldn't be who's the most advanced. Who do you think is addressing it at the right pace at the moment? Are there models out there and jurisdictions we can look towards? Or is Australia doing the right thing?
So I think Australia's not doing too badly, to be quite honest. There's been various criticisms around the amount of money that governments put into AI industry development in Australia. But in terms of thinking about appropriate use, I think Australia has been doing quite well. I'm literally just back from Singapore and was talking to the people in Singapore who set up their AI assurance framework, and we compared notes about the New South Wales assurance framework versus their assurance framework. And we all agreed that there are strengths to each approach, but a united approach, dare I say, an agreed or harmonised approach would actually be a better thing to do for our part of the world. So I can speak with some confidence around what New South Wales was doing, having been the New South Wales Chief Data Scientist for 8.5 years. We adopted the framework of deliberate but cautious. We are ultimately going to use AI. We are using data in many, many different ways, but that use should be done cautiously. It's the exact opposite of run fast and break things. But deliberate and cautious was the mantra, and then building assurance frameworks around that, thinking ahead about what those risks might be as we move from amplify, accelerate, adapt to create, translate, interpolate. And then trying to ensure that was a nationally consistent approach, working with other jurisdictions, has actually, I think, served Australia quite well. And just last Friday, the Australian Assurance Framework for AI came out, which makes specific reference to the New South Wales Assurance Framework as a risk model, as a way of connecting between the principles of what we want AI to do and what do you do when you're sitting in front of a data set, or the risk frameworks and what do you do when you're sitting in front of the algorithm. And that approach, I think, has really served us well, and it has been quite well appreciated in other parts of the world. It's what happens next that I think is really important. So as we are users primarily of this technology, there are some great exceptions, but predominantly Australians are users of these new versions of AI, these generative models, these new foundational models. And we've all heard recently about some pretty awful uses of this technology for a whole lot of really terrible things, again, that we hadn't envisaged. So I think the important thing for us to do is lean into that question of how can we take advantage of all the good elements of AI? How can create, translate, interpolate work to create value? And then how do we put in place frameworks that prevent bad things from happening from that create, interpolate, translate capability? So the race is not run. It's definitely the case that we can learn from all parts of the world. Standards are really helping because they're helping with that fundamental of this is what you do with the data, this is how to think about the algorithm, this is how to put the pieces together, this is the number of points in the life cycle you need to think about checking in on your AI. But we still need to agree we're all going to drive on the same side of the road. We all need to agree we'll drive on the left side of the road. We need to agree things like what speed limit do we have outside schools. The analogy is that while standards are helping us a great deal with the fundamentals and the engineering elements, there are some things that we need to agree as society about what's acceptable and what are the appropriate norms.
Thank you. I think you just mentioned the assurance framework. And when I was reading through the notes for this and preparing, a word jumped off the page, hallucination. And it certainly caused my ears to prick up, especially a sort of empirical background. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to perhaps explore a little bit how do processes such as the AI assurance framework, how will they serve towards mitigating that risk, and perhaps explain a little bit of how it might be implemented?
Okay, it's hard to go past the word hallucination. I mean, what was one of the interesting features of large language models, and I'm sure we've all had experience of working with large language models and experienced some of those hallucinations. Hallucination is a pretty valid engineering concept. You've got multiple different optima, and you work towards one of those optimum, but if you've asked a question between two optimum, you get an interpolation. That interpolation becomes a hallucination, depending on just how funny it is. Otherwise, it's just a mistake. When we're thinking about AI in New South Wales, and again, I'm going to put on the yes to me outfit and talk about the role as Chief Data Scientist for New South Wales. Again, pre-generative AI, pre-large language models, we thought about AI it's a use of data. And so when you're thinking there, looking at your AI project that you're really proud of, what we tried to do was help people decompose it into the data use bit. So AI creates a data product. It might be an insight, it might be an alert, an alarm, a decision, or an action, but it creates a data product. We also can think about it as an algorithm, and we can think about it as data. And so what we did was we said, if you're sitting there and looking at a project where you're doing something really important and valuable with AI, such as mobile phone detection for drivers, now you will have heard in New South Wales about seatbelt detection. There's a data product which is created. In this case, it's an alert that this driver looks like they're holding a mobile phone. And we need to think about how we can use that data product in an appropriate way, where we think about the harms associated with use, with repeated use, with bystander implications, and all of the possible sorts of harms that could arise, and then think about mitigations associated with them. But if we're still uncomfortable about the project, we say, let's take the AI out. Let's put that aside. And if we're really still uncomfortable, let's take the data piece out and put that aside. And effectively ask ourselves the question, if we had a paper-based process with someone writing information into a paper-based system and doing it, would we still have a problem? And so then it gets back to the use of that data product. And so we think about what we could do to mitigate those potential harms. Then we can put the data back in and say, well, we need to think about data quality, the implications of including or not including minority groups or people from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds, the implications of using data of a particular variety, and think about those biases and those implications. And then we put the algorithm back in and say, let's understand the biases introduced by this algorithm, let's understand the interaction between the algorithm and the data. And let's then think about how all those pieces join up to produce this data product. And would we think differently about those mitigations now that we know more about the algorithm, now that we know more about the data? And that approach of what we're doing, the algorithmic issues and the data issues, stood us in good stead until generative AI came along. So the New South Wales framework was developed through 2021, was made mandatory, went to New South Wales Cabinet December 2021, was made mandatory in New South Wales in March 2022. Generative AI came along in November 2022, and people suddenly thought the sky was falling. So we went back and revisited that process and said, now that AI can do that, not just amplify, accelerate, adapt, but it can do that generate, translate, interpolate, do we need to rethink what those protections are? And part of the answer is yes, because we can't see the data. We can't see the algorithm. So really our protections need to be around the data products that are created that generate, translate, interpolate that song, that report, that video, and the uses of those, because we can't realistically interrogate the algorithm and we can't realistically interrogate the data. So the protections and the checking in and the treatment like a black box suddenly move to this is how we would deal with those data products. So I'm sure I answered a completely different question to what you asked, but that process of decomposition served us well, and that process of understanding if we can't see inside the black box, then this is what we must do in terms of how we can use those data products became a much greater focus.
No, I think you did answer the question.
Oh, good.
But it's almost an impossible question to answer as well. I was really interested as you were coming through the answer there that you touched on taking the AI elements out, the data elements out, and getting back to thinking if this was just a paper-based system. And a lot that I've been hearing, even over the last couple of days here, is, oh, we need to put that human step in. And while you were speaking, it just kind of dawned on me that what NATA is about is accrediting human processes to a great extent. And it's also recognising that the accreditation process is to ensure that humans can do their job properly, and ensuring that the laboratory is competent and all the other things that we work on when we're accrediting a laboratory. And maybe that mindset applied to the application of AI, because I think the simple concept of, oh, well, if we put a human in the line, it's going to be fine. Well, I think there's plenty of examples where humans have been somewhat fallible, and I think the whole concept of NATA accreditation is on the assumption that you need systems for a human to work to, just as you might need systems for AI to work to. So it starts to take, in my mind, it starts to take me a little bit closer to somewhat of an answer. Bringing it back to accreditation, you've used the word accelerate and amplify quite a lot, but the other word that keeps coming up at the end of that is adapt. And while the world of accreditation and the world of quality infrastructure, the words continuous improvement are no mystery to us. It's underpins the concept of quality management, this concept of continuous improvement. But there's a big leap from continuous improvement to self-adaptation of a system. And I just wonder, is it worth, or are you able to explore that a little bit in context to our role of quality infrastructure and accreditation, this concept of self-adaptation and how we might start to think about it and perhaps come to terms with it?
Yeah, it's a whole lot easier, again, if we take these newer generations of AI, just put them aside for a moment and think about good old-fashioned AI, so that 70-odd years up until the end of 2022. And of course, there are a couple of ways to think about it. If you're converging on a process, or if you've got an algorithm which is getting better and better and better at getting exactly that point in the middle of something, that's a good activity. And convergent processes are actually quite well constrained, and even though they're adapting within a reasonable area of uncertainty and hopefully getting better and better over time. It's where algorithms really are not constrained and can go off and do wild and wonderful things that really start to create challenges. So if you had an autonomous train, for example, and it started to stop just a little bit short of every station and increasingly stop a little short of every station to the point where passengers couldn't get off, you would certainly need to have tolerance limitations on that to say, this is not good anymore, this is a fault, and we need to think about how we would do that differently. And there's good control systems engineering that helps in that process. But if you've got something that is deciding, such as that driver holding a mobile phone, if you're going through the process of driver-passenger, driver holding something that looks like a mobile phone, is it a chocolate bar or a mobile phone? It's a mobile phone. Going through that process, if there was an automatic closed loop on that, which then led to a fine, you could imagine that would be a pretty seriously bad system, which is why, in fact, there is a human in the loop. And in the very first cases, every image that was flagged as being potentially someone holding a mobile phone went to the commissioner, and the commissioner decided. That human in the loop was not just some human, it was the person who was ultimately responsible, who was capable, who was in charge of that decision-making process, was prepared to say no if they didn't think that was right, or was authorised to make the decision if they did think it was right. And that's an example of good human in the loop for a potentially non-convergent process. I mean, over time, algorithms could start picking out all sorts of interesting things. For example, people eating their dinner off their lap while they're driving along. That's a different sort of risk, and possibly something that should be flagged, but it's not a driver holding a mobile phone, which is the output of the target of that particular algorithm. So putting a human being in the loop who's competent and capable and who has enough time to make that decision is an important part of managing potentially divergent algorithms. If we now just quickly think now about what we can do with the new sorts of AI that generate and translate and interpolate, it's really hard to put that same test of false positives and false negatives on something which generates a song. Is it always the same song that generates? Or is it a song of the right style that's generated? It's really hard because the outcome space is so much more massive. But we can apply some similar sorts of tests on that about consistency and repeatability, and whether or not through various sorts of framings whether or not it is actually hitting the target based on multiple different domains that we can explore. So it's a long way to go before we can apply these same sort of engineered constraints onto generative AI and large language models. But some of the principles around harnessing and constraining or measuring the constraint around the outcomes, including things like repeatability, those principles are still possible, but we are definitely not there yet.
Okay. It's, I guess it begs the question, and again, putting my simplistic hat on, in the world of accreditation, if we're doing things like software verification, it's as simple as having a set of pet numbers that you put in to make sure you get the right answer out with the pet numbers. It's a closed system. Does your answer suggest, and I won't pose this as a question because I don't think it can be answered, but do we need to think very hard about their use in a laboratory setting or a clinical setting until we do have the answer on how we test that open network? And as I said, I don't think it's for answering today, but we don't want to get down the black letter law bands, but it is a question that I think the industry as a whole will have to deal with.
Yeah, if I can offer a very quick reflection.
Please.
My good old-fashioned HB calculator, when I had it, had a self-test button. I could press it and the calculator would tell me if it was working. Those sorts of principles can still be done with large language models or generative AI. Are you functioning the way you're supposed to be functioning? Yes or no? And if not, in what areas are you not functioning? And again, that constrained outputs is also a possible framework, but there's still, I think there really is a long way to go.
You mentioned back in the dark ages, pre-generative, and way back in the 1990s, I'll admit that, look at the grey hair, I was involved in the Australian launch of a range of fire detectors that actually used fuzzy logic and neural networks to learn and adapt to their environment over time. And when we first brought these into the country, it was quite a revelation, but there was an understandable level of distrust over the concept of adaptation versus the traditional fire detector, which had a fixed trigger point. And we knew when the smoke was at this level, it went off. And here we had a detector that actually looked at smoke, fire, and heat, and the daily environment in the area it was protecting, and made some decisions. Are you seeing, in generative AI, in some areas I'm seeing a very high level of trust. Are we applying enough care at the moment in these models, or do we need to be a little bit more cautious?
So in general, if you're planning to do anything with data, and irrespective of how sophisticated the algorithm, whether it's a simple rules-based system or whether it's a large language model, it's actually care and craft and curation of the data, which is a really important part. So if you're doing an observation, or if you're doing some sort of network, some sort of environmental sensing, ensuring you've got that part, all the stuff you need to know before you use the data, and then an understanding of the fitness for purpose of that data for the purpose you're about to use, then we've got an opportunity to start thinking about the guidance or restrictions or prohibitions even we put around those data products. And in this case, the data product could be an alert, an alarm, a decision, or an action if it's an operational AI system. Increasingly, we're beginning to understand if it's important, if this part is important, then getting the data right, the data governance right, the data curation right is really important. And assessing that fitness for purpose is also really important. That gives us then a real basis for thinking about how much we can rely on the data products that come out, especially in operational systems.
Okay, thank you. Now, my floor manager tells me we've got some questions from the audience, so I'd like to hand back to Steve and take those if we could.
Thank you. We do indeed. Time for a couple of quick questions. The first one is from Greg Ryan. And Greg observes that history shows that technology can never be contained to those with good intent. Therefore, what defences are on the horizon for combating A1 programmed with sinister intent? And I'll leave it to each of you to decide who's going to respond or whether you both want to.
I'm happy to let you go first.
We certainly have seen bad versions of AI very recently, and there were versions of generative AI that were jailbroken to allow generation of spam and viruses and all sorts of things. And recently, everyone will have heard about the recent incidents about tools that undress people or can undress images. So maluses of AI are absolutely possible and are absolutely happening. So part of what vendors do is try and put in place rules that stop that jailbreaking, and those rules are getting better and better. They're no longer rules, they're now governance systems. Part of what we can do, of course, is in the digital environments that we engage in, the people who supply those digital environments to us could also put in place those supervisory systems. And then, unfortunately, a whole lot of the rest of it is then thinking about what regulatory protections you need to put in place now that you can do things like you've never been able to do before. So, and then, of course, we can teach each other about appropriate behaviour.
And I'd like to touch on that just from the accreditation and laboratory perspective. You know, over at the CSIRO labs at North Ryde that I know very well, they've got an air cannon there that can shoot lumps of 2x4 across the room at an amazing speed, and that could be used for some fairly evil purposes. Traditionally, it's been used for cyclone protection of buildings and understanding. I think as an industry, the accreditation industry, I think we need to focus on how we can use AI to improve what we do and make it better. And yes, there are misuses, but I think if we get too distracted, huddling in corners, complaining about the misuses, we can distract ourselves from actually using it for the benefit. So I think the conversations need to be had, and I think they definitely need to be had at a government and a policy level. But I think we also need brilliant technical minds to be looking at how we can use it for benefit and positive outcomes as well.
This question, and I hope my pronunciation isn't too off mark, from Chedaswi Shetty. And the question is, have there been any protection stroke controls put in place yet to monitor and regulate requirements for people involved in managing AI to avoid negative socio-economic implications?
Let me try answering that question in terms of data, because data is my favourite thing to talk about. And recently, a standard has been released, an ISO IEC standard, 5207, terminology and use cases, and 5212, guidance for usage of data. And what that standard 5212 talks about are the layers of control that you can conceptualise for uses of data, for all the things you need to do with data before you use it, all the things you need to consider out data as you use it, and again, those protections or guidance or even prohibitions you put around the data products you create, whether that data product is a simple data product, an aggregate, a summation, a statistic, or whether it's an AI output, an alert, alarm, a decision, or an action. And the conceptual model talks about very high control, moderate control, low control, and no control environments. And ultimately, it depends on which environment you're in. But the intention is that if you're dealing with sensitive or personal information or data products that can be harmful, then you need a lot of protections. You need people, and you need processes, and you need guarantees, you need knowledge, you need expertise, and then you need commitment to certain behaviours. But as those controls loosen off to the point where you've got no control, where the data is out in the public or the data products are out in the public, then the protections again become really important, and the elements of the data products you create have to be low sensitivity, low personal information, leading to data products which have minimal ways that you can potentially misuse them. That's at least the principle. The challenge, of course, is you put out a really powerful tool that can draw in any data set that you want to put in place, and you create these horrific data products which are potentially very, very harmful. So at the moment, apart from essentially a punitive approach around what are the implications once you have done this thing, there are not exactly a lot of good frameworks for thinking about those protections. And I think we really need to move into that environment where we must understand that when data and algorithmic products are released to the outside world, they can cause great harm, and we must therefore provide people knowledge, understanding, and experience around what not to do, but also put in place whatever restrictions we can to try and prevent those products from being used maliciously or even in some cases used at all.
A question from David Harris. From a legal standpoint, will reliability be more important than explainability when adopting AI in a clinical setting?
That sounds like a dangerous question. You take it.
I don't know where to start with it. I think as soon as we throw the word clinical setting in, the whole paradigm shifts because the downside, you start to apply a risk model at that point and suddenly all the risks move into the catastrophic category that it could be loss of life. So it becomes a really difficult question. But I think I'll take a cop-out and I'll use Ian's answer from an earlier question. And I'll take two cop-outs here. One, reminding people I'm far from an AI expert. I'm an enthusiastic amateur who's having this thrust upon them. But I think the cop-out is, if you take the AI and the data out of the question in the clinical setting, is the fundamental model working and is it appropriate for the risk profiles that you're working within, and then put the data and the AI back. I think sometimes we're looking too much at the tool and not at the use of the tool. So I think we might be overcomplicating the question by trying to look at AI as the cause of a problem that isn't actually the cause of the problem. The fundamental cause is the model that sits under it and the framework under which it's being applied. I'm happy for Ian to jump in on that.
Can I just risk a career just a little bit further? There are two examples I'd like to give of AI being used in a genuine clinical setting. One is the New South Wales sepsis prediction, so monitoring of patients for sepsis episodes in real time, which is an algorithm that will alert or alarm if it believes a patient is about to have a sepsis episode. Compare that to a nurse doing a round of a ward and writing notes down and going back to the desk, punching the details in to a report, and an alert pops up and says that patient you saw 10 minutes ago is about to have a sepsis episode. There's a real issue around whether or not we can at least compare to existing processes and whether we can improve on it. Does that stand a legal challenge? There's a whole lot of elements of that which would, but there's still the issue of who's responsible. And the other example I'll just quickly touch on is Harrison AI, the work that they did around embryo selection for IVF. And way back in 2018, a typical doctor was getting around 25 to 30% success rates from embryo selection leading to the outcome of live birth, 25, 30% of the time, versus an algorithm that could sit there and monitor all the time, and it got a 93% success rate through its recommendations. It still recommended to a doctor. The doctor then made the decision, but which doctor would accept their own success rate, 25 to 30%, compared to the 93% of the algorithm? Then the issue actually becomes a little bit inverted. Well, why didn't you take the recommendation of the algorithm, and what right did you have to do that, or what responsibility did you adopt? So I think there are some really important issues that still need to be tested, but ultimately AI is a tool, and that tool is, like any other tool, still subject to the same sorts of regulatory and risk frameworks.
Okay, the last question is mine, and it's coming from someone of my age, as a lay person who finds himself or herself overwhelmed with all the technology and all the references to AI and what it can and can't do. So my question is, are we doing enough to reassure a suspicious, even wary public about AI and the future? And if we're not doing enough, what more should we be doing?
I think it's a really interesting policy question, and again, it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think it's really important to have technical experts in the policy discussion, but in setting any sort of regulatory environment or public good outcome, I think it's everything has to be, technical aspects have to always be tempered with societal expectation and societal understanding. And so I don't know if that's a question that a group of accreditation experts can answer or should answer. I think what is really important is they are at the table where that answer is created. And that, I think, is, for me, and with my NATA hat on especially, that's the important role. It's not that we have the answer, but I think we need to be at the table alongside societal expectation and our policy leaders where those answers are created. And that goes for all of our other colleagues in this infrastructure, Standards Australia, JASANS and NMI.
I'll give you 30 seconds, Ian.
Almost none of us know how cars work, not really, in terms of all of the intricacies of how an automobile works. But we're all happy to drive them because we have testing, we have standards, and we have a knowledge that people must learn and get a license to drive a car. We need to make AI an unextraordinary thing, make it as ordinary as possible, as quickly as possible, and do the same sorts of things. Standards, testing, certification, and regular inspection. And let's make it unextraordinary.
And that's where NATA comes in.
Absolutely, and that's where NATA comes in.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Dr. Mark Burgess and Dr. Ian Oppermann. Thank you, gentlemen.